Hi, everybody, and thank you again for joining our call today. We are so grateful so many of you could take your time out of your day and check out our new poll results. With that, we are pleased to have our CLC board chair with us today, Jim Weil, who's going to make some introductory remarks. Jim?
Sure. Thanks, Randy. Hi, everyone. I'm Jim Weil, president of the Food Research and Action Center and chair of the board of the Children's Leadership Council. I want to welcome you to today's conference call, where we're releasing new polling data from Children's Leadership Council on investing in America's children and youth. As everybody on this call knows, children and their families have a huge range of challenges: a slow recovery, stagnant wages, inadequate public programs. And these challenges exist for all types of families, working and non-working, young kids, old kids, and so on. Census Bureau data released last month showed that more than 45 million people, including nearly 15 million kids, are living in poverty. So all these challenges mean that adequate federal investments in children and youth are really more and more essential. And last month, Children's Leadership Council contracted with Hart Research Associates to conduct a short poll to measure public support for increasing federal investments in programs that address children's needs in areas like early childhood education, healthcare, nutrition, broader well-being. And today we're going to hear what the polling data show, talk about some ideas for how to use the data, talk about resources that are going to be available to help you use the new data to raise awareness of and support for investment programs and services that help children and families. Our speakers today are Guy Molyneux, who's a partner with Hart Research Associates, led the work on the poll, Caitlin Johnson, who's co-founder and managing editor of Spark Action, and Randy Schmidt, who you've already heard from briefly, who's executive director of the Children's Leadership Council. So let's start. I'm going to turn it over to Randy.
Thanks, Jim, and thank you all for joining us again. With that, now I'd like to turn it over to Guy Molyneux to talk about the poll. And after Guy speaks, he's going to turn it right over to Caitlin, where we'll hear about some resources, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Thank you, Randy, and thank you, Jim. Thank you for asking us to be your partners on this project. I'm going to be fairly quickly going through the highlights of the survey data. What we've done for the Children's Leadership Council is, I apologize for the siren behind me, it'll be gone in a second. We've interviewed a representative sample of American adults, 808 adults across the country. And when I say representative, what that means is this is reflective of the country's actual adult population in terms of gender, race, age, geography, factors like that. And the margin of error for these results is plus or minus 3.5 percentage points. And the interviews, as you can see, were conducted at the end of September from the 25th to 29th. Turning to the first result, we began by asking our survey respondents how they would feel about the idea of Congress expanding federal funding for programs and services that address children's needs. Not a very specific financial or fiscal proposal, but broadly measuring support for the idea of Congress making a larger commitment to investment in children's programs and children's services. And the results here were very encouraging, with about 8 in 10 Americans saying that they would favor that kind of investment. 79% said that. And perhaps more impressively was that 61% said that they strongly favored expanding federal investment. I mentioned that this is a survey of adults as opposed to registered voters. A lot of surveys you see these days are only among voters. In this case, it really doesn't make a very material difference. So, for example, on this question, 77% of registered voters favored this expanded federal funding as opposed to 79% of all adults. So as you can see, whether we talk about the adults or the voters does not make a very substantial difference here. If you look at the next slide, if you can see, we've broken out the results on this question among a number of different population subgroups across the country. The most important story here is that support for increased funding is extremely broad and cuts across nearly all different ways we might choose to divide up the country's population. For example, in regional terms, more than 3/4 of the adults in all 4 regions of the country favor increased funding. All age groups support higher funding, although younger adults tend to be even more strongly in favor than older adults, but in all age groups the support is very, very strong. Interestingly, there's very little difference by age or level of education, a slightly stronger support at the lower ends of sort of the SES scale, but not big differences there. We do see a rather substantial gender gap. 72% of men and 86% of women favor increased funding. And as you'll see, that gender gap appears in a number of these questions. In partisan terms, there is a difference between Democrats, Independents, and Republicans, as we would have anticipated, with Democrats being almost universally in favor of increased children's funding. But I thought it was interesting that the support was as strong as it was among Republicans at 59%, so almost a 2-to-1 margin of favor over opposed there. And interestingly, among Republican women, 2/3, 67%, favor increased funding for children's programs. If we turn to the next slide, slide 4 in the PowerPoint, immediately after asking about that idea of increased funding, we asked our respondents about the idea of a candidate who embraced that agenda, who committed himself or herself to supporting increased funding for children's programs, and asked whether that would make people more or less likely to support a candidate if they knew they were a supporter of greater congressional funding for children's programs. Here, unlike the other results in the survey, we're going to break out the results only among the registered voters because that's most germane for this question about the impact on voting preferences. And you can see that by a ratio of 5-to-1,
very good idea.
Voters say that they are more likely rather than less likely to support a pro-children's investments candidate. The rest saying this would not affect their vote one way or the other. Again, you can see regionally not big differences here. In every part of the country, being a candidate who supports investment in children is a political plus, much, much more than it is a minus. We do see, again, a gender gap with women by a 51-point margin saying they'd be more rather than less likely to support this children's candidate. It's also a political advantage among male voters, but not by that same kind of overwhelming margin. Here it's 32 points with men versus that 51-point advantage with women. Interestingly, we again see that there's a big gender gap, especially within the ranks of Republican voters. Among Republican men, they divide fairly evenly on whether they'd be more versus less likely to vote for this candidate, but Republican women, by more than 2-to-1, say they would be inclined to vote for a children's investment candidate. On to the slide number 5. We then set the bar a little bit higher. So we begin by asking people, would they support investments in children? The answer is overwhelmingly positive. Now we set a little bit harder test where we ask Americans to choose between 2 competing budget priorities. One is investing in children's health, education, and well-being. The other, usually historically a fairly popular idea, is the idea of reducing taxes. And obviously there is at some level some kind of trade-off between investing in children versus the need for revenue. So we asked voters, if you have to choose, would you rather invest in children or see taxes reduced? And this I thought was a very positive finding for the children's community, precisely because it is in some ways a more challenging test of public support for the children's agenda than the prior 2 questions. Still, by a very solid 18-point margin, we see that adults, but also voters say they would prefer to invest in children's well-being and health than see taxes go down. The numbers being 54% and 36% respectively. Again, we see that's true in every region of the country. It is true, but only barely so among men at 46 to 42%, The strong margin here is driven almost entirely by the overwhelming preference of women for children's investments over tax reduction by better than 2 to 1. So here's where we see a particularly dramatic gender gap. And not much differences in terms of income. Younger voters do express a bit stronger commitment to children, as we often expect. A lot of those adults under age 40 are themselves parents, but still we see good support for investment in the older generations as well. We don't picture here, but there are partisan differences, as you might imagine, when we start to give people a choice between the traditionally important Republican or conservative priority of tax reduction as against the children's investment agenda. Democrats overwhelmingly prefer the children's investment by 76 to 19%. Independents, importantly those voters in the middle, they prefer investment also by a 21-point margin, 54 to 33%. Republicans do prefer tax reduction by 57% to 29%, but still that's only a slight majority of Republicans who come down preferring tax reduction. And interestingly, among Republican women, they are divided almost evenly on this question. 44% of Republican women preferring tax reduction to 38% preferring the children's agenda. So really Republican women are divided, whereas Republican men overwhelmingly want to see taxes lowered. I should mention that on these questions where we see this big gender gap among Republicans, we do not see one among Democrats. Democratic men and Democratic women tend to be united in support of children's investments as a priority. On the next slide, which is number 6 of your PowerPoint deck, we ask a question that again asks voters to choose between two competing ideas. This one getting at the appropriate role of government in supporting children. And we've asked people to choose between a progressive statement affirming that America's children would be better off if the government did more to support parents by making education, child care, nutrition, and health care more affordable, as opposed to a more conservative statement that America's children would be better off if the government got out of the way and let parents and families take care of their children. I thought it was very encouraging to see the magnitude of the difference here with 61% agreeing more with that first statement and just 33% agreeing more with the idea that we should be basically government should just get out of the way and let families take care of children instead of interfering. Democrats, as to no one's surprise, agree more with the first statement by 80% to 19%. But perhaps more surprising was that independents very strongly agree that government has a role to play by a 34-point margin. And while Republicans come down on the side of wanting government to get out of the way by 59% to 35%, again, that's driven by a very strong anti-government view among Republican men, who by 67 to 28% prefer that second statement. But among Republican women, it's a very close decision here, 42% agreeing with the top statement, 50% with the idea that government should get out of the way. So there again, we see Republican women being divided, with many of them seeing a role for government. I think it is worth noting the way this first statement is written. I think part of what makes it appealing is the idea that government is supporting parents by making these essential elements more affordable for families, as opposed, for example, to saying that the government should simply provide all of these services directly. So I think it's, one reason for this very large margin here is that people are selecting not some kind of, the idea that government should essentially be taking care of every child in the nation, but rather that children should be helping, supporting families to allow them to raise their children successfully. And that idea is government as a partner for families to help children and to give more opportunity to children is a very compelling idea to most voters, as opposed to this idea that government should simply get out of our way. If we look at the next slide, here we've just brought together the differences between men and women on several of these questions. I've alluded to a couple of these results already, but just to help people see the magnitude of this gender gap that emerges from this data, we thought it was helpful to bring it together in one place here. And you can see how consistent it is that women expect more support for public investment in children's programs and services, whether that's just on that first question, supporting it in general, or being more likely to support a candidate who embraces that kind of federal investment. But also on this last question that we mentioned, that children, the question we showed you about whether children are better off if government does more versus get out of the way. Women are 14 points more likely to agree that government has an important role to play. And they are much more likely than men to agree that children's investments is a higher priority for the federal budget than tax reduction is. Finally, one last question we asked, and personally I just found this one to be particularly interesting because of the way it fits into an emerging debate I see in the country that bears on children's investments, has to do with the idea of competing interests between generations, between children on the one hand and older Americans on the other. An idea that we increasingly hear that fiscal pressures on government going forward essentially require us as a nation to choose children over seniors or seniors over children because there simply isn't enough money to provide adequately for both. And you can see that argument made here on the bottom of the slide that the coming retirement of the baby boom generations means we cannot afford to spend more on programs for children and families now because of that coming cost of meeting our promises to the baby boom generation as they retire. That view is rejected by a pretty overwhelming margin of about 3-1 here, in favor of the idea that the retirement of the boomers actually means we need to invest more in children now, because the best way to provide for today's older workers as they retire is to ensure there is a productive class of workers contributing to the economy in the future. I think that's a very important idea that apparently is fairly intuitive to voters when we present it to them, that for the people who are now retired or those who will be retiring over the next 10 or 20 years, for them to collect their Medicare and collect their Social Security benefits requires a productive economy and productive workers in that economy, and that in turn is more likely to happen if we make investments in our young people today. And so it turns this whole idea around that we hear from a lot of pundits that we must make a choice between the generations, and instead suggests that the interests of young people and the interests of older Americans are ultimately closely joined because our ability to provide for retirees is so dependent on the productivity and health and success of today's children as they enter the workforce in the future. So with that, let me stop with the survey results and turn it back over to, is it Randy?
Thanks, Caitlin. The floor is all yours.
Great. Thanks, Randy. I want to leave some time at the end for us to dig into this data and ask questions and grapple with this, because these are exciting results. So I'll make this quick. I just want to start by saying thank you again, Guy, for this, and Jim and Randy for commissioning this poll. It's great to have this data, and it's great to have it now, in part because so many children and young people and families are facing the kinds of economic challenges that Jim discussed excuse me, at the start of this call. Also, as we head into the elections next month, this is really important data to have. And I hope that it will be useful for folks to use locally to share, both to share with the media, with policymakers, and help you support and further your messages and the outreach that you're doing. In order to help you do that and to make that easy, we've got a series of shareable sample social media posts, a blog post that you can customize and tailor, some talking points to help you both in talking with the media and policymakers and candidates, and other resources and materials, including some shareable images and graphics. You'll find all of this on the CLC website, and there's a shortcut link. Randy will send this around after the call, but the shortcut bit.ly link, for those of you familiar with bit.ly, it's bit.ly/CLC poll. So it's pretty easy. It's bit.ly/CLC poll. And again, you'll find it also just by going to childrensleadershipcouncil.org. For the media, we hope that you'll use Twitter to tweet and direct message reporters and bloggers with these findings. I want to mention also that a further way that this is very timely is that in the last few days, the Opportunity Index, Opportunity Nation's annual report, came out and has some pretty stunning data on how children and young people are faring in our current economy. They tend to do a pretty big press outreach and get a lot of attention, so we should be seeing this week, and we've started to see in many cases, articles about the index, which give us an opportunity to take these poll results and craft comments in response to articles that have been published, write letters to the editor, draft op-eds as well. And again, we have resources to help you do that on the CLC website. There's also been, several of you have seen, and some people are on the call who were behind some of these analyses, but there have been analyses of the recent Census Bureau supplemental poverty measure that I think is also a good hook for us to use with this new poll results. And finally, the Kids Count, the Annie A. Casey Foundation Kids Count will be coming out with a 2-generation report in early November, which also is likely to get some press coverage and is another opportunity for us to both reinforce the findings of all of these reports and this data, and also share this polling information with people. And of course, many of you have your own reports and information that have been coming out, and I hope that this data will actually help support and reinforce some of those. The other way that we hope that you'll use these, and our materials are designed to help you do that, is to ask questions of candidates over the next couple of weeks at candidate forums, or even by directly engaging with candidates on their websites and on their social media networks. We have a list of talking points that should help you do that, and a distillation of the findings that Guy just went into on the website. So again, that is at bit.ly/CLC poll. That'll take you right to the packet that's got all this information and graphics. You'll also get the recording of today's call and the PowerPoint that Guy just walked us through. And I will stop right there and leave room for questions. We have a few minutes left, and I'd love to hear some questions. So Randy, back to you.
Thank you, Caitlin, and thank you, Guy. We're going to jump right in. We have about 4 or 5 minutes, so we'll get to the questions. Guy, we have had a few questions about the data, and while the CLC poll didn't dive into this, do you know if there's any data, or have you seen any data that shows the public view on whether they support new revenue or taxes if their taxes are done locally rather than at the state or federal level?
Boy, that's a hard question to answer quickly. Support for revenue depends a lot on how it's raised, and different kinds of taxes, and whether people feel confident that it really will be used for a purpose that they support, like children's investment. Basically, if I had to give a short answer, I would say that right now, public sentiment is not supportive of cutting taxes very much, whereas 10, 20 years ago, we often saw the public demanding tax reductions. We generally don't see that today. At the same time, we find it is still difficult in most places, most of the time, to win majority support for higher taxes. Not always impossible. It can be done, but it often has to be carefully done in terms of both the kind of tax being increased and assurances of how it's going to be spent. What we generally find is there's a lot of support for raising taxes on high-income people and or closing loopholes that benefit high-income people or corporations, much less support for broad-based taxes on middle-income people.
Great, thank you. We have got a few questions about messaging and what works with different audiences. I'll take one that goes with the election right now, since that's on everybody's mind. So we found that the public is investing in children and youth, yet candidates who favor these investments may quite possibly not do too well in the upcoming elections. Do either of you have any suggestions about how these findings can be used to shift thinking towards children's issues and away from whatever is most on voters' minds right now?
This is Caitlin. I'll jump in and then let Guy answer as well. But I think the biggest, the way these are going to be the most useful is actually after the election. I think there's so many factors that are going to determine who votes for whom during this upcoming election, and many of us are aware that it is that some of the candidates who do support, increasing investment in children and young people may not fare very well. But I don't think that we should be discouraged. This is a long game, and and we need to take a long view. And these findings, I think, are going to be helpful for a long time to come. After the election, I think it's really important that we use these and talk about these and try to generate discussion about these findings, both in the in the lame duck session when they'll be grappling with some appropriations and some spending bills, but also in the longer term when the new Congress is seated, and we can remind folks that this is, these are the findings and we're watching. To that, I'll just add that the CLC is going to do an op-ed project after the election that we really would like everybody to be involved in. It'll generate some op-ed templates and some op-ed ideas for everybody in the network, the CLC and its allies, to place both nationally and locally. And we'll be, and I think that's an important thing to do, and writing letters to the editor. And we'll also have an action alert, a zip code activated, very easy to use action alert for the next Congress, just making sure that we can all let our elected officials know that that we are among the majority of Americans who support these sorts of investments.
Yeah, I think it's certainly true that to the extent that candidates who support children's investments don't fare well this in November, which I'm not prepared to concede yet, but it certainly is not looking like a great election year for those kind of candidates. That the causes are diverse and have little, if anything, to do with their support for children's investments, although the fact that the public remains skeptical about federal spending in the aggregate, leaving children aside, is still a political obstacle that we face. The one thing I would point to here, and I've mentioned this a couple times already, is the divisions along gender lines within the Republican Party on these issues. There is a potential, I think, to build support among Republican women for children's investments, as long, but it's going to be tricky, and it's important that those investments not be seen as Democratic or as Obama-inspired investments. So the politics of that get very complex often. But I do think that something to be thinking about is how do you build kind of institutionally within the Republican Party sort of more of a voice, not only for women, but especially for women within the party who may support, perhaps not as large a government role as a lot of you on this call would support, but a larger one than the Tea Party currently envisions.
And I do think we're just to add to that, I agree, and I think we are starting actually to hear some surprising folks talking the talk that we'd like to hear. Whether that actually means they're going to support the kinds of policies that the CLC supports remains to be seen. But I think in this economic climate, it's pretty hard to ignore the challenges that are facing children and young people and families. So I do think that there are going to be some unexpected allies in the future, and that's going to be on a lot of issues in juvenile justice, in economic security supports, and all sorts of places. So I think it's up to us to find those folks, work with them, and do what we can to get this information out there a little bit more broadly.
The other thing you might think about in the immediate aftermath is look for a few examples that cut the other way. If Senator Hagan is reelected, I think it would be fair to say a big reason that Tillis will have fallen short is his role in cutting spending in education, particularly, and other areas. If Brownback and or LePage go down, similar cases could be made there. Obviously, I don't know how any of those elections are going to turn out yet, but to the extent some of them turn out the way you're hoping, I would sort of press that case that candidates who go too far in the opposite direction, too far in the direction of cutting children's funding, do so at their political peril, even in a year in which conservative candidates did well.
Those are great points. Thank you so much. We have time for one last question. We're running just a little bit over. So I'm going to roll two questions into one. What messages work with different audiences, especially conservatives, when it comes to funding children's programs? Either of you have heard, have any idea on that? And where investments have increased in children's programs, what are some effective advocacy strategies that have achieved this? So one is sort of a messaging question, and the other is more about tactics and strategies.
Why don't I address the message question? I'll let someone else address the strategy question. I would point to two things when trying to communicate with more moderate to conservative voters. One I touched on earlier, that it's very important that programs and services be presented as supports for families, not as a displacement of or replacement of families. And not that I think anybody on this call is likely to go out there and actively suggest that government should sort of replace moms and dads and grandparents in children's lives. But recognizing that your opponents will accuse you of essentially doing just that, it's important to be sort of anticipate that and make sure that we, affirmatively talk about the ways in which we understand that families play a central role in providing for and raising children, and that the programs and services we're advocating are designed to help them do that job well, not in any way take their place in any kind of broad sense. The other thing that tends to help with those audiences is to remind them of ways in which investing in children now may reduce other public sector costs down the road, whether that's remedial education, whether that's criminal justice expenses for young people when they go off the tracks. There are many ways in which we know that investments in children now, particularly at younger ages, have payoffs for taxpayers in reducing other public sector costs later, and reminding voters of that can often make them more willing to consider spending money now if there's a potential payoff to taxpayers later.
Sounds great. This is Caitlin. I wish there was a communications panacea. I mean, I wish there was a message that we could find that would get everybody moved to increase investments in the programs that we know work and support the legislation and the services that we at the CLC and our allies support. It's unfortunately, as we all know, it's not that easy. And I think I'd be curious to know, to sort of turn it back out there, I'm curious to know if other folks in the network, in the CLC and our allies have done recent messaging work. I'd love to see it. I know there's been some done around a campaign that just launched last month called Grads of Life at gradsoflife.org. Which is a campaign sponsored by the Opportunity Youth Network, many organizations that work in workforce development and reconnecting young people, and the Ad Council. And that campaign targets employers and did a lot of message testing and found that, it's rather than sort of saying young people who have dropped out and are working to reconnect deserve to be considered for jobs, they really tested some messages that work with employers and found that an economic message, this is a huge untapped pool of potential. These are resilient, resourceful, creative, smart people who need, you should consider, and if you don't consider them, you sort of do it at your own peril. I think that messaging can be useful, and I'm happy to share what I'm able to share of that. And other folks should definitely check out gradsoflife.org. The other thing is I've seen work is finding unusual allies. In Kansas, the Kids Count organization, Kansas Action for Children, did a really interesting work with the with Americans for Prosperity. They worked for years to get legislation passed to improve oral health for young people. And when connected with Americans for Prosperity, they were able actually to target certain policymakers who were key policymakers with an economic argument. And it was a challenging collaboration, I think, for everyone involved, but it was effective, it worked, and they did it well. So thinking about folks locally and in our states that we may not be collaborating with, we may not be working with, but we can reach out to and bring them in around this idea that we all fundamentally believe that, for the cliche that the children are our future, and that all young people do deserve to succeed, and they deserve an opportunity, they deserve a shot. So those are sort of two things that come to mind. But again, I'd love to see us all sort of share the messaging work that we have access to and that we know about, and see if we can kind of try some of this and test some of this out as a network.
Yeah, thank you guys both for that. I will just say I know a few groups have done polling on messaging around and public support for early care and education programs, as well as the Children's Health Insurance Program. So those are other resources as well that I know that are floating out there. With that, I'm going to wrap up. I know we had a few other questions. People should feel free, if they want additional information or have questions that were not answered, to email info@children'sleadershipcouncil.org, and I'll make sure we get to all of those. Again, we want to thank you for joining us today. You will be receiving more information about the polling and resources Caitlin talked about, as well as a link to this call. With that, we are going to wrap up today's call. Thank you so much for joining.